During my years in law enforcement, I worked just about every kind of paid detail you could imagine. Special Mardi Gras details, festivals, school events, hospitals, warehouses, construction sites, and buildings waiting to be renovated or torn down. Most details were easy money. You showed up, remained visible, checked the property, and made sure nothing happened until your relief arrived. But there was one detail: I worked at an old railroad facility that I never volunteered for again. For years, I told almost no one what happened there. Even now, part of me still tries to find a reasonable explanation for what I saw that night. This happened in the early 2000s. I had just completed my regular shift and drove directly to the railroad detail without going home. That was not unusual. Officers frequently worked paid details after finishing a full shift, and I had worked much longer days before. I was tired, but I was alert, and I knew the difference between fatigue, imagination, and something that required my attention. The railroad facility sat near the edge of an industrial district, several miles from the nearest residential neighborhood. It was not a passenger station in the traditional sense. It was a sprawling storage and maintenance property where locomotives and passenger cars were kept between assignments. Several tracks ran through the open yard, while others continued into a massive steel building that looked more like an aircraft hangar than a train station. Rows of locomotives sat beneath high metal rafters, and old passenger cars stretched into darkened sections where many of the overhead lights had burned out or been shut off. Narrow walkways ran between the tracks, and maintenance pits opened beneath certain sections of rail. The security office was positioned near the main entrance. Inside were a desk, a telephone, a radio charger, a large ring of keys, and several small television monitors connected to cameras throughout the facility. The system was already old by that time. The images were grainy, and the recordings were stored on videotape. Two of the cameras occasionally rolled or flickered when they lost their signal, but the system covered every main entrance, the rear gate, the parking area, and several sections of the indoor tracks. The officer I was relieving had been there since late afternoon. He was an experienced officer whom I knew well enough to recognize when something was bothering him. That night, he looked ready to leave before I had even signed the detail sheet. I asked whether the night had been quiet. He glanced toward the camera monitors before answering. So far, there was something strange in the way he said it, but I did not press him. He handed me the keys and reviewed the usual trouble spots. A side gate near the rear fence sometimes failed to latch properly. Teenagers had occasionally entered the yard to spray graffiti on the passenger cars, and copper thieves had tried more than once to steal wiring from older equipment. Everything he told me sounded routine. As he reached the office door, he stopped and looked back at me. "If you hear anything down near track 7, check the cameras first." I asked him why. He gave me a slight smile, but there was no humor in it. "Because it's a long walk." That was all he said. I watched him cross the parking lot, get into his car, and drive away. Once his taillights disappeared beyond the front gate, the entire facility seemed to settle into silence. A railroad yard is never completely quiet. Metal contracts as it cools. Airlines release pressure. Loose chains strike against steel. Electrical equipment hums inside locomotives that appear to be shut down. When the wind moves through a building that large, the walls and rafters can produce sounds that seem to come from everywhere at once. I knew that, and at first I barely noticed any of it. I checked the entrances, reviewed the security log, inspected the rear gate, and made a quick walk through the occupied section of the building. Every exterior door was locked. No vehicles remained in the employee parking area, and I found no indication that anyone else was still on the property. When I returned to the security office, I reviewed the camera feeds. I rewound the recording far enough to see the officer I had relieved walking through the main hallway and entering the office. Several minutes later, my car appeared in the parking lot. I watched myself enter the building, and then I watched the other officer leave. No one followed him out. No one slipped in behind me. No door opened after his departure. According to the cameras, I was the only person left inside that facility. The first unusual sound came shortly before midnight. A heavy metallic impact echoed from deep inside the indoor yard, followed by the unmistakable crash of one rail car coupling with another. Anyone who has stood near two train cars when they connect knows that sound. It does not merely reach your ears. It travels through the ground and hits you in the chest. I immediately turned toward the monitors, expecting to see a locomotive moving or a maintenance employee step between the cars, but every engine remained in place. Nothing on the cameras appeared to have moved. I waited for several seconds, listening for an engine or another impact. When nothing followed, I picked up my flashlight and left the office. The beam cut through suspended dust as I walked along the center aisle. My footsteps echoed from the steel walls and returned from different directions. The farther I moved from the office, the colder the air seemed to become. I reached the first row of passenger cars and stopped. One of the doors stood partly open. I was almost certain it had been closed during my earlier inspection. I shined my flashlight into the entrance and announced myself. "Police officer. If anyone is inside, make yourself known." No one answered. I moved closer. The car was old, probably from the 1960s or 1970s. Its windows were clouded with dirt, and several rows of seats had been removed. The interior smelled of grease, dust, damp fabric, and rusted metal. I stepped onto the lower stair and listened. Something moved near the rear of the car. It sounded like the sole of a shoe dragging slowly across the floor. At that point, I was not thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural. I believed I had a trespasser hiding inside a passenger car, possibly waiting for me to enter. I grabbed my service weapon and stared into the darkness. At first, I assumed I was dealing with a man who had entered the property unnoticed and concealed himself inside the train. But then a feeling came over me that I had never experienced before. I wasn't about to face a man, and whatever was waiting inside didn't fear a badge or a bullet. I drew my weapon, raised my flashlight, and entered the car. The first section was empty. I moved carefully between the remaining seats, checking the floor, the corners, and the spaces beneath them. The light from the building faded behind me as I approached the center of the car. The temperature continued dropping until my breath became visible. Then I heard 3 slow footsteps on the roof directly above me. I stopped, and the footsteps stopped. I moved forward again, and they followed me, 1 step for every step I took. I looked toward the ceiling, knowing there was no safe or reasonable explanation for anyone walking on top of that passenger car in the dark. I began backing toward the exit. The footsteps continued until I stepped out onto the platform. Then they stopped directly above my head. I moved several feet away and swept my flashlight across the roof. Nothing was there. I returned to the security office and looked at the monitor covering that track. The passenger car door was closed. I stared at the screen, knowing I had not closed it. I rewound the recording and watched myself approach the car with my flashlight. The video showed me entering. A moment later, the picture distorted and filled with horizontal lines. When the image stabilized, I was seen backing out of the car. Behind me, standing inside the doorway, was a man. He wore dark work clothes and held something at his side that resembled an old railroad lantern. His face could not be seen clearly. His head was lowered, and the image flickered across his body as though the camera could not fully capture him. I paused the recording and turned toward the office window. The tracks beyond the glass were empty. I checked every entrance camera again. No doors had opened. No one had crossed the parking area, climbed the fence, or entered through the rear gate. I considered radioing for another unit. Had I still believed I was dealing with a trespasser, I would have requested backup immediately. But I no longer believed a living person had entered that facility. There are certain things an officer does not say over an open police channel unless he is prepared to hear jokes about them for the rest of his career. I had seen what ridicule could do to officers who spoke too freely about things they could not explain, so I remained silent. I told myself the camera had malfunctioned. The figure could have been a reflection, a shadow, or a distortion created by the aging recording equipment. I was still trying to convince myself of that when the desk telephone rang. I answered, identified the security office, and waited. No one spoke. All I heard was a faint scraping noise, followed by a man's whisper. Track 7. The line went dead. I checked the telephone, but there was no indication of where the call had originated. I picked up my portable radio and attempted to contact communications. The radio gave a weak warning tone, and the battery indicator flashed. I had used that same battery throughout my regular shift before going directly to the detail. Batteries went dead. It happened, especially after a long tour of duty. I keyed the microphone and began identifying myself, but the radio clicked off before I could complete the transmission. I tried again and received nothing. The failure concerned me, but I did not immediately consider it supernatural. I still had the office telephone if I needed assistance. What I did not have was a reasonable explanation for the voice telling me to go to track 7. I checked the camera covering that area. At first, the track appeared empty. Then the image rolled. When it stabilized, a figure stood between two passenger cars with his back toward the camera. A lantern hung from his right hand. I leaned closer to the monitor. The man slowly turned his head without moving the rest of his body. He looked directly toward the camera, and the screen went black. I stood, took the keys, and left the security office. Staying behind the desk was not going to tell me whether someone had somehow entered the property. If there was a trespasser, I needed to locate him. If the camera system was failing, I needed to verify the area physically. At least, that was what I told myself as I approached the oldest section of the indoor yard. Track 7 ran through a part of the building where several overhead lights no longer worked. Long sections of rail were hidden in darkness. As I approached, I noticed an odor that had not been there earlier. It smelled like heated metal, old blood, wet clothing, and something rotting beneath the floor. I swept my flashlight between the cars and called out, "Police officer, come out where I can see you." A yellow light appeared approximately 50 yards away. It came from an old railroad lantern held by a man standing beside one of the locomotives. He wore a railroad cap and heavy work clothes. One side of his body sagged lower than the other, as though his back and legs had been badly injured. I ordered him to step into the light. He remained still. I advanced several feet until the beam from my flashlight reached him. His coat was torn and darkened with grease. A metal identification tag hung from his chest. His left arm had been flattened against his body at an impossible angle, and his shoulder appeared crushed inward. I stopped moving. The man slowly lifted his head. His face looked as though it had been pressed between two enormous pieces of machinery. One side of his skull was compressed. His jaw hung at the wrong angle, but his remaining eye stared directly at me. The lantern slipped from his hand and struck the concrete without making a sound. At that same instant, every light in the building went out. I raised my weapon and began backing away. Somewhere in the darkness, a locomotive horn erupted. The blast was so loud that I felt it vibrate through my body. Then the man screamed. It was not the scream of an injured worker reliving the moment of his death. It was a sound of hatred and rage. The lights flickered back on. The track was empty. I turned toward the security office, but the rows of trains no longer appeared the way I remembered them. A locomotive now blocked the aisle I had used to reach track 7. I knew it had not been there before. No engine had started. No wheels had moved. Yet thousands of pounds of steel stood between me and the office. I moved around the front of the locomotive and entered the next aisle. That route should have led toward the main entrance. Instead, it brought me back to track 7. The lantern was once again glowing in the distance, and the switchman stood behind it. This time, he was closer. I turned and moved in the opposite direction, only to return to the same location a minute later. No matter which aisle I chose, the tracks led me back to him. A speaker crackled somewhere above me. The public address system had been silent all night, but a distorted voice now filled the building. "You came to relieve him." I looked toward the ceiling as the words repeated. At first, I assumed the voice meant the officer who had left when my detail began. Then the switchman raised his crushed arm and pointed toward the rails beneath his feet. "No," the voice said. "You came to relieve me." The lantern began moving toward me. The switchman did not appear to walk. Each time the overhead lights flickered, he was suddenly several feet closer. I raised my weapon and ordered him to stay back. My voice echoed through the building, but he continued advancing. For the first time in my career, the weapon in my hand felt completely useless. I did not fire. There was nothing solid or clearly identifiable to shoot at, and I was not going to send rounds through a railroad facility at a figure that might vanish before the bullet reached it. I backed into the space between two passenger cars. The couplers above me groaned, and both cars began moving inward. No locomotive was connected to them. Steel wheels screamed against the rails as the space around me narrowed. I climbed onto the side platform of one car and pulled myself up just before the couplers slammed together beneath me. The impact shook the entire building. I forced open the passenger door and entered the darkened car. The seats that had previously been torn or removed were now intact, and every one of them was occupied. Men and women sat silently on both sides of the aisle, dressed in clothing from another time. Some wore railroad uniforms. Others wore work clothes darkened with soot and blood. Every passenger had his or her head lowered. As I passed, they began turning toward me one at a time. Their faces were gray and lifeless. Some appeared burned. Others had injuries consistent with being crushed beneath machinery. A young man near the rear of the car lifted his head and whispered, "Don't follow the lantern." The interior lights went out. I pushed through the rear door and dropped to the ground. When I looked through the window again, the car was empty. I ran toward the security office. This time, the aisle remained open. I entered, locked the door behind me, and pushed the desk against it. The camera monitors were still functioning, but every screen showed the switchman. On one camera, he stood near track 7. On another, he stood beside the passenger car. On a third, he stood directly outside the security office. I looked through the office window. No one was there. The telephone rang again, but I did not answer it. The ringing stopped, and 3 slow knocks sounded against the office door. I remained silent. A man's voice came from the hallway. It sounded exactly like the officer I had relieved. "Open the door." I forgot my keys. I looked at the front entrance monitor. His car was not in the parking lot. The metal key ring lay on the desk beside me, and every key assigned to the detail was accounted for. I said nothing. The door handle began turning, and a dark fluid seeped beneath the door. It spread across the floor in a thick line and stopped only inches from my shoes. The smell of blood and decay filled the room. My radio suddenly came alive on the desk. Static burst from the speaker, followed by the dispatcher calling what sounded like my unit number. I grabbed it and attempted to transmit. "Communications, I need assistance at the railroad detail." Only static answered. I tried again. The switchman's voice came through the speaker. "I need relief." The office lights went out. Something struck the door with enough force to move the desk several inches. I braced myself against it as another impact shook the wall. A crack began spreading across the window beside the door. Through the damaged glass, I saw the yellow glow of the lantern. I do not know how long I remained behind that desk. At some point, the pounding stopped. The air grew warmer, and I heard birds outside. When daylight finally entered through the front windows, the dark fluid beneath the door was gone. The window was unbroken, and the desk stood exactly where it had been before I moved it. At 6 o'clock, the morning supervisor arrived with the officer assigned to relieve me. I did not tell them everything. I said I had experienced electrical problems, heard unusual noises, and observed possible movement near one of the passenger cars. The supervisor listened without interrupting. Then he asked, "Track 7. I looked at him. "How did you know?" He did not answer. Instead, he went to the camera system and reviewed the overnight recording. The footage showed me walking through the facility alone. It showed me entering the passenger car, standing near track 7 with my weapon drawn, running between rows of locomotives, and climbing onto the side of a rail car. But none of the trains appeared to move. No passengers could be seen inside the car. No one knocked on the office door. To anyone watching, I looked like a man reacting to things that were not there. Then the supervisor paused the tape. A figure stood several feet behind me. The switchman had followed me through almost every section of the facility. Whenever I turned around, he disappeared from the camera. Whenever I looked away, he returned. Sometimes he was 10 feet behind me. At other times, he was close enough to reach out and touch my shoulder. The supervisor ejected the cassette from the recorder and placed it inside his coat. I asked what he was doing. He replied that the security system had malfunctioned. I told him that what we had just seen was not a malfunction. He stared at me for several seconds before finally speaking. A railroad worker died on track 7 in 1958. He was crushed between two cars after complaining for months that the switching equipment was unsafe. The company blamed him for the accident, said he ignored procedure. I looked toward the dark section of the building. What was his name? The supervisor shook his head. You don't need to know. Why is he still here? He looked down at the cassette in his hand. Maybe because no one ever admitted what really happened. Maybe because he died angry. Or maybe whatever walks those tracks isn't him anymore. He told me that several guards had reported seeing a lantern near track 7. One resigned immediately. Another was found wandering beside the rails shortly before dawn, repeatedly saying that he was waiting for someone to relieve him. I asked what happened to the recordings from those nights. The supervisor placed the tape into his bag and said, "The same thing that's going to happen to this one." I never returned to that train facility. I didn't file a report about the switchman, the lantern, or the voice that called me from inside those cars. I wrote that the night had been uneventful and that the property was secure. That was the safest lie I ever told. But every now and then, when I hear a train horn late at night, I think about that security recording and the man who followed me for nearly 3 hours without ever appearing when I turned around.